right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your Friday afternoon. I know it's a gorgeous day to spend time with us here with Student Council and the Miller Center, who has so graciously offered their support and co-sponsorship of Student Council's event titled How to Fix American Democracy. So that's a pretty vague, broad, ambitious title for an event. We've kind of been joking about it with our team. Today we're fixing American democracy. So I bet a lot of you are wondering how this event kind of came about. So in October, I read an article in the Washington Post that collated a number of ideas on projects from thought leaders, elected leaders, artists, historians, scholars from across the ideological spectrum who had dedicated their work to coming up with innovative ways to address problems that many of us have identified, especially in the last couple of years in our systems of politics at the local, state and national level. And I was really inspired by this list of ideas and said, you know, what if we bring some of these conversations to the University of Virginia? I am a firm believer that part of our charge here is to educate students who are not just intellectual products who go out and fulfill a specific job, but who see themselves as part of a national citizenry, who understand their commitment to a democracy, to something bigger than themselves, to serving others. And why not begin some of those conversations with the students that are graduating, that are leaving to go out into the world, who we hope can have hope. We hope they can have hope. Hope has been a word that I think has been lost in the past few years in politics. There is a lot of frustration. There is a great deal of throwing in the towel. I'm too exhausted to engage. I'm confused. I don't know what's going on. But we can't lose hope, because if we don't have hope, then we can't get the next generation of leaders in positions of power to create the changes that we all want to see in our country, and to bring about the goals that we all have for ourselves, for one another, and for this nation. And so without further ado, I would like to now introduce Avery, who will speak about our first keynote address. So thank you all for being here today, and I hope you enjoy the program.
I'd like to introduce you all to our special guest, who in November of 2016 was elected as the 80th and youngest mayor in Richmond's history. A proud graduate of James Madison University, he is a former executive director of the Democratic Party of Virginia, who, in 2014, became the first African American to serve as Secretary of the Commonwealth of Virginia after being appointed by Governor Terry McAuliffe. In that role, he led the largest, oldest, most public-facing office of the governor's cabinet, and was the driving force behind transforming the process that has restored civil and voting rights to more than 18,000 disenfranchised Virginians, more than the past 7 administrations combined. Since his election as mayor, he has distinguished himself as a progressive, energetic, and innovative leader who is redefining the way city government works and is promoting community engagement and regional cooperation to build what he calls One Richmond, a city that is welcoming, inclusive, and works for all. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Richmond Mayor LeVar M. Stoney.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Well, I want to thank the Student Council and the Miller Center for hosting us this afternoon. Madam President, thank you for allowing me to be in your presence. And Avery, a Richmonder, thank you for the invite to Charlottesville. Today's the Tom Tom Festival. I've already spoken earlier, and I'm glad to be here and to talk about how we can, I would say, better our democracy. My entry into civic life, I would say, began a little bit differently than probably some others. My parents My father never graduated from high school. My grandmother was a domestic laborer who raised me as well. They weren't very participatory when it comes to our democracy. We didn't have one of those households where we sat around the table and talked about the current events or civic life in general. I learned about politics and government through television. And it was through television I picked up on liking people like Dr. King and the Kennedys. And when I was a young child, I remember going to the library, and instead of checking out books for the Berenstain Bears and Dr. Seuss, I requested to check out books on all the biographies of each and every president. And I remember when the librarian said, no, first graders and second graders are over here. These are for the big kids. And I didn't stand for it. I told my teacher when I got back to the classroom, because as you know, going to the library is like an elective, a resource. I said I didn't get to check out the book I wanted to. And she took me down, and I got to check out a biography, and I checked out one every time we went to the library. Now, I didn't know how to read all those books, but it was an introduction to, it told a story for me, and it was like almost, it's all like a dream, like a fantasy. It's putting yourself in the shoes of some of these presidents, from Millard Fillmore to Ronald Reagan. I read all of those books. And that inspired me to be involved a little bit, in student council at the elementary school level. And I remember I ran to be a representative of my class. I lost. And but something said never to give up. My father always taught that, we don't quit, no matter what the circumstances may be. In elementary school, I was president of the student, vice president of the student body. In middle school, I was president of the student body. In high school, I was president of the student body. In college, I was also president of the student body. So I kind of always thought leadership was always the path for me. I remember being younger, and I lived in a private apartment complex, a community. My father was the head of maintenance for my community. But I just thought there was a disparity in sort of the resources that were available to younger African-American kids who lived in the community compared to some of our friends who were white. And I'm sorry I didn't play tennis, and I didn't play soccer as well. But I remember that the basketball court was always in disrepair. And people would say something, but they never did anything about it. And my father, as I said earlier, worked for the community. And so I wrote a letter to the management. And I didn't think about what the consequences could be possibly for my father. But I wrote a letter to the management, and my dad sat me down later that afternoon and said, "Did you write a letter to my boss?" And I said, "Yes, Dad." And the guy's name was Mr. Cotton. And I said, I addressed it to Mr. Cotton, and I said, "It's just unfair that we've gone without the proper facility for us to have fun and be kids for so long, and I want to see something change." And sure enough, they put up a new basketball court. Now, I guess I could have gone down there and marched and gathered all my friends and did it in sort of more of an activist approach, but I thought maybe we'll use the process. And that's always what's driven me, is to be able to participate in the process. My father taught me and my brother that we should never have a chip on our shoulders when we enter the classroom, that we should be always prepared to compete. And sometimes the process and democracy it's about competition. I played football growing up, and was a quarterback of my football team. I love football, but I also love politics and government as well, because the ability to compete. And when I left high school, I got a 5 on my AP government test, and I knew what I needed to get into. I needed to get involved in politics and government, so I majored in political science, double major in political science and public administration, and my involvement in student government in college kind of opened up my whole eyes of how politics really worked. I probably spent too much time in student government than I did actually in the classroom. But I had an opportunity to, I think, work hands-on on issues I thought that our student body cared about. And I realized after a couple years in the Student Senate that I wanted to do something a little bit more than just argue about the Constitution or the bylaws of our organization. And I became a student body president my sophomore year. I got elected my sophomore year. I was a two-time student body president. And then the issues that really mattered, I thought, this is bigger than what the organization can really handle in terms of race and in terms of women's reproductive rights kind of showed up at the front door. And there is one initiative that I was intimately involved in, and that was when there were some elected leaders on our Board of Visitors. Actually, Senator Obenchain, who was on the Board of Visitors at the time, and others who decided they wanted to remove the morning after pill, limiting reproductive options for students on campus. And I guess I could have receded to the background, but I thought it was a role for student government. And so not only did we pass legislation calling for the reinstatement of the morning after pill to our health center, but we also marched down to the offices of members of the boards of visitors. And I took to writing op-eds in the Richmond Times-Dispatch. That, for the first time, showed me that people will listen if we speak up. Now, it's easy to be on the sidelines, I think, and complain and whine about what's going on in your community, what's going on at your school. It's a whole lot harder to do something about it. And that's why I always chose to get involved, because as they've said in the past, it's either about, either you're at the table or you're on the menu. And I refuse to be on the menu. For a long period of time in our history, there have been young people, women, people of color who have been marginalized and pushed into the corners of society. And normally that is because sometimes they lack a voice at the table. My entry into politics on the elected side of things was all about ensuring that the people of the city I live in, that's populated half the population is between 20 and 40 years old in the city of Richmond, that they have a voice in the direction of our city. And the same principles that carried me through student governance in my college years still power me and sustain me today. And that is to speak up for those who lack a voice and to right wrongs. And let your results speak for themselves. Everything doesn't have to be, in order for me to win, you have to lose. And I think, unfortunately, what we've seen in democracy today, what we see on TV, by the images or the rhetoric that might be coming out of Washington, D.C., is that in order for us to do anything, it means someone has to lose. And I refuse to think that one has to lose in order for the entirety, our entire community, our entire country to win. And so I operate from, yes, I have my firm beliefs. However, I'm all about getting something done. I've been that way when I was a student, and I'm that way today. And as a mayor, we're asked to be a whole lot more pragmatic than many other elected officials, because everything isn't about Democrat and Republican and who wins and who doesn't win. It's about getting the job done for our constituents. And I think that gives us a lot more perspective, a better perspective, I guess, in getting things done. And that's what I see we lack right now in Congress or in the state legislature sometimes, is the ability to get the big things done as a country, because we're too tied in and we're too combative about our ideals. And so for me, I think for young people, I would request that you not shy away from engagement and speaking your mind and speaking truth to power as well. I think what we lack and what we're seeing today what we lacked beforehand was the ability, the willingness for young people to step up and actually move the needle. I was able to march with 5,000 to 6,000 young people in the city of Richmond on the day of the Never Again marches. And it was one of the more beautiful sights I've seen in our city in a very, very long time. People from different hues, from different communities all coming together behind one common issue, one principled issue, and that is to keep communities and schools safe and the elimination of guns. But it's something we've seen before in our society, whether it was in the civil rights movement when Dr. King and others were planning the movement, and they stated that they wanted to get children involved, high schoolers involved, and some thought it was too dangerous. But once those images were seen around the world of kids being blasted with fire hoses or dogs being sicked on young men and women of color, Congress finally made a change. And so the young people out there who are in student government or whatever you choose to do, I think they are the drivers of change. They are true change agents. And if they can stick on the path of choosing to get involved and to get engaged and be in the arena instead of being on the sidelines, I think our country and our communities will all be definitely better places. So thank you so much, and I'll take some questions. Shy crowd, okay.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. So this summer is probably pretty challenging with the whole monument issue. Yeah. And I'd like you, can you just talk a little bit about what that was like in terms of leadership and how you determined what was the path you were going to take?
Yeah, so I guess in June of 2017, I initiated the process and created the Monument Avenue Commission. And I guess when I got elected and sworn in January of 2017, I foresaw the wave coming to Richmond. And I told my team, we're going to have to do something about this sooner rather than later. So we were in the works of talking about creating this commission that would actually discuss telling the entire story about the monuments that stand on Monument Avenue in the city of Richmond, a grand tree-lined avenue it's the address to have in the city of Richmond. I would say the address to have in Virginia, period. And we have 6 statues, one to Arthur Ashe, and then another 5 other to generals, and one to Jefferson Davis. And the commission, we began our work talking about providing more context to those monuments, telling the full story about them, how they got there, why they were put there, and what the intention was behind them. And then the events here in Charlottesville occurred. And as I watched those images on TV, I knew that what was occurring in Charlottesville could easily occur in Richmond as well, and that we were not immune. And so a few days after that, I decided that what was not on the table was the discussion of removing those monuments. And when that option was not on the table, many decided not to participate and said that there's no use to attending any of your meetings because my point of view is not represented in the scope of the commission. And then once the events in Charlottesville occurred, I decided that we should expand the scope and consider removal as well. And we'll continue to have a robust conversation about what the future of those monuments are going to be. Now, I have my own personal opinions. I do believe that Richmond should not be memorializing those who I think fought for a country that would, not include people who look like myself. However, the commission made up of historians and artists and professors are going to provide some recommendations to me and my team by the end of May. And we're going to do something. We must do something. I do believe that it is monuments tell others around the world what the city's all about. What do you believe in? There's a particular place where I think that they can still tell their story. I just don't believe that maybe they should be on grand avenues in one's town. Thank you. Avery?
So, I guess I wanted to ask, when at a university campus, especially with VCU in Richmond, oftentimes the youth can present a large possible voting demographic if they choose to vote. So, what do you think we can do as students or citizens in a community with large student populations in order to ensure that incoming new college students both have the availability, accessibility, and drive to get out and vote on Election Day?
Well, ever since you worked on my campaign, for full disclosure, you understand that the student voice was a big part of my coalition in becoming the 80th mayor of the great city of Richmond. And I will first start with government. We have to make it easier for people to vote. We're one of the countries in the world, and I think that we are the greatest democracy in the world. However, all 50 states, we put up barriers for people to vote. I'm sorry, not in all states, but in some states we put up barriers for people to vote. And we should not do that. We should make it easier for people to vote, not more difficult. We're in a state where, if you commit a felony, you lose the right to vote forever. That's in our Constitution. And I'm into a more participatory democracy where we want to open up opportunities for people to vote. So first, I've been traveling my city in high schools and also visiting the 4 colleges in our city limits, telling folks to register to vote if you haven't, right? What you see on TV can be changed very, very easily by you participating and adding your voice to the process. So government has a side as a part of this, and then the onus is on the people who actually have the franchise. However, elections should not be the only time we actually hear from students or from young people. You have to be involved 24/7. From what's happening outside your front door, whether it's crime or homelessness, to what building might be erected in your neighborhood, we have to hear from you. And that's why I think it's a very, 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 very powerful to see young people involved at the local level. Because a lot of young people want to sit on the sidelines until the presidential years, right? And yeah, I want to see you voting in your presidential year, but I really want to see your voice goes a whole lot further in low turnout elections where you can actually help dictate the direction of your smaller community. And I think sometimes young people don't recognize that. And those who are at the table making the laws, writing the ordinances, passing the ordinances, normally don't look like us. Now, I'm a millennial. 37, born 1981, I'm an older millennial, okay? And Richmond right now, 23% of the population is between the ages of 20 and 30 years old. And then those between 31 and 40-year-olds make up another 20-some% of the population. So roughly half our city is between the ages of 20 and 40 years old, 40 years old. And we have one of the highest amounts of elected leaders in the state between the ages of 20 and 40. So we're getting elected leaders who look like our community. And that would not have happened without students actually participating. And so I do my part in engaging. You can easily just go into civic neighborhood associations and forget about visiting campuses. But like I said, it's a part of the governing coalition now. And so we must pay attention to their voices.
Actually, a follow-up on that, because I'm a local voter registrar. I'd like for you to tell the story about restoration of rights, and I've heard you talk about what that means to you personally, yes. But also what institutional and political obstacles did you have to overcome during that process? Thank you.
Yes, when I was formerly the Secretary of the Commonwealth during Governor McCall's tenure, and when we took office, the governor charged me with reforming the way we restore the rights to former offenders. He was of the firm belief, and I agreed with him, that once you've served your time and paid your debt to society, you should be restored fully. And that means receiving the franchise back as well. And prior to our administration, I remember, reading news clips of former offenders having to jump through so many hoops, pages and pages of an application, writing a letter of forgiveness, things I think that are, obstacles I think that are unnecessary. So I incrementally started to reform the process year by year, reducing the application to one page, making it accessible online. Saying now that former more serious offenders didn't have to wait as long wait any longer as well. And before I left, I was able to sit down with Governor McAuliffe and said, you know what, we should do a mass restoration of rights here in the Commonwealth. It's a wrong that was instituted in the 1902 Virginia Constitution that also featured poll taxes and literacy tests. Folks don't recognize that right after Reconstruction, right after the Civil War, there were 24 elected leaders, African American leaders, in the Virginia General Assembly. And then by the 1880s, 1890s, we were down to maybe 4. By the time 1902 came around, there were 0. We didn't have an African American elected into the General Assembly until 1968. After that. And so this was an obvious relic of the Jim Crow past of Virginia. And we wanted to eliminate that. And now, after the governor's work in signing those executive orders, one by one, after being sued many times by the Republican Party, now more than 175,000 people in this Commonwealth of Virginia have the franchise. That's more than any. That's the largest restoration of voting rights in the entire history of the United States of America by a governor. And I look back at the obstacles and the fear of taking those steps, those bold steps, and the connection to my story that my father was a former offender, was a felon. And I remember him walking around with that scarlet letter every single day, and what it does to an individual to receive that signed order in their hand saying you have the right to vote again. The number of grown men and women who cried on my shoulder and said that they now feel like a full citizen again. To me, one of the most rewarding things I've ever done in public service. Now, I'm early in my public service to Virginia, but at the moment it stands at one of the things I'm most proud of. That now folks will now be able to lend their voice to the process. Yes, ma'am.
Can go without a microphone. So just along the lines of, I guess, millennial engagement, Gen X, Gen Z, how would you propose to encourage young people to run for office? Because that's a very difficult sell when a lot of young people actually turn towards the world of technology for leadership now rather than looking at our government. And it's very important to look at our government. There are only things our government can solve. However, you really have to telemarket yourself, almost. And it's not something necessarily someone who should be running for office might want to do.
That's right. I had my own obstacles when I thought about running for office. My friends and I gathered around the table when I was 34, and I said, "Is Richmond going to be able to? Will we really elect a 35-year-old?" And I had so many people actually tell me to wait my turn. I'm not from here. I haven't lived here long enough. I'm too young, and they didn't know that kind of just made me double down on the reason why I should run. And what I've come to find out is that not only are young people, but sometimes African Americans and women are given those same sort of excuses to why they shouldn't run for office. And now, more than ever, I think after I said we've been seeing these images on TV and hearing the rhetoric in our national, in the national dialogue, more and more people are actually stepping up and saying, you know what, it is, if not me, then who? Who will change the direction of my community or change the dialogue, the rhetoric that young people are hearing in general? And you're right, it's easy, once again, to go to Facebook and Instagram and to Snapchat about an issue. Those are tools, I think. However, it's a lot harder to put yourself before the people and stand up for what you believe in. And for any young person who's considering running for office, yeah, it's difficult work. It's harder, actually, than governing at times. But it's so worthwhile. Because for a very, very long time in many communities, those are the voices that are normally silenced and then pushed into the shadows. And to have young people in my community come to me and say that, you know, you have restored my faith in government. Because for many, many young people, they choose not to participate because they think government's what government's always been. And that is, you can't trust government, we never get anything done. And I think I'm showing in my community that we can still, government can still be a vehicle for good. But I will say this, there are many, many ways to become more engaged in your community. I've chosen the path of government and politics, but nonprofits out there also are making an impact in our communities, and also in the business world is also making an impact. That's particularly when we talk about social entrepreneurship. I've just personally chosen politics and government because I think it's the greatest way to make an impact, a collective impact in my community. Yes, sir.
Thank you for coming to speak. I wanted to ask a question about the Richmond City Public Schools. So some researchers would say that it's segregated along class as well as racial lines. And have you heard that before? What would your plan be to address that? And any other thoughts you have on that issue?
I have heard that before, and I agree with that. I do believe that our city schools are segregated. I think a study came out recently that 73 out of 100 babies born in the city of Richmond attend Richmond Public Schools, enroll in Richmond Public Schools, while counties that surround us, Hanover, for instance, 125 of 100 babies born end up in their public schools. That means our babies are ending up in Hanover and Henrico and Chesterfield counties. During the years of white flight, many white families moved out into the counties. And now, just now, we are starting to see more and more people move back into the city. However, they're not enrolling their kids into Richmond Public Schools, and I understand why. Our school system has been failing for a number of years, and I have a lot of faith in the new superintendent we've acquired from Washington, D.C., but there's still a lot of work to do. I've had a number of residents at one time say to me, you know, the bus system and the public schools are for the poor people in our city, and why should I have to pay for it? And I think folks don't realize that as more and more people move into our city, and as young millennials, young white millennials move into our city, my job is to ensure that they can stay here long term, because it helps with the tax base. And between the ages of 20 and 40 years old, these are folks in their prime earning years. And I have to recognize where they spend their dollars. Do they spend their dollars here in Richmond, or do they spend their dollars in the outlying counties? And I prefer them to spend their dollars here. But what we have to do is we have to double down on investing in public education. I went to the people earlier this year and asked for a tax increase to invest in new schools for our city. We have some of the oldest schooling stocks in the Commonwealth of Virginia, because we're one of the older cities in the Commonwealth. And we had kids going to schools that were 100 plus years old, that the likes of Henry Marsh and Doug Wilder attended back in the 1940s, and they said to me that the schools were unfit then when they went to school in the 1940s. And so in 2018 to have young kids go to school with jackets on every single day, that's a problem. So we're going to fix that with the $150 million that will be available to us over the next 5 years. there is, outside of churches on Sunday, I've visited every school. When you walk into schools where there's 90% African American or 90% Latino, yet you know there are white families who live in our city, we have a choice to make. Either we can perpetuate these sort of injustices and inequities of the past, or we could go about fixing them. And that is, our members on the school board have a choice before them. They have the tools at their disposal to rezone the school district. And we have to use that power. And normally, I think New York Times spoke about this, leaders in those positions end up actually exaggerating or exacerbating the divisions inside their school systems by the lines that they draw, right? Because you've allowed population or constituency in your say, I don't want to include these neighborhoods in my community. If so, I'm going to move out. And that's the hard part about politics, that everybody is never going to win. But it's about doing the right thing. And in Richmond, I have influence over the process, but unfortunately I don't get to draw the lines or make decisions on curriculum. So it's going to take some moral backbone from all of our leaders. Yes, sir.
I'm interested in your reading background as a young man. The biographies must have been very interesting. But what got you ready to govern as opposed to get elected? When you realized you were going to be a candidate, at some point you must have realized you had to do the job. What did you do to prepare yourself to do the job? In your case, mayor.
Can I just repeat the question for the people
Yes,
who are on the live
sure.
stream? You asked just what did Mayor Stoney do to prepare to be mayor? How did he prepare for his job, correct?
Transition from getting elected to learning how to govern.
Yes.
Right, and how was the transition from your election to the formal transition process in which you are now serving in the role of mayor?
Yeah, so first I was a state official. And so state government and local government, two totally different things, right? Two totally different things. I've been lucky to have mentors, people like Terry McAuliffe, but to me that's not enough. You actually have to not only did I research mayors that kind of fit in my profile, people like Adrian Finney or Kasim Reed or Cory Booker, and had conversations with them from around the country. I also wanted to research the folks who were at one time bright stars and their failings. People like Ray Nagin or Kwame Kilpatrick out of Detroit. I want to see what is the difference between those who actually had successful tenures and those who had unsuccessful tenures. Ray Nagin and Kwame Kilpatrick are serving prison time. Cory Booker is a U.S. Senator. Adrian Fenty, I think, made one of the most monumental changes in Washington, D.C. public schools. So I wanted to research what they did and what those who went the wrong path did as well. I additionally also reached out to someone who was a mayor for more than 40 years in Charleston, South Carolina, and Joe Riley. And I spent hours, a couple hours on the phone talking to him about what can I do as a young mayor, number one, but what can I do just as a mayor to impact public education or even placemaking in my city. Land use policies, things of that nature. One of the things that he said he said, well, how old are you? I said, I'll be 35, just Joe Riley. He said, well, you should visit every school in your city. I said, well, sir, that's 44 schools. He said, well, you have a whole year, you got 365 days. Make it happen. That was so informative to me, I think. And it gave me faith. And when I sat down with Kasim Reed from Atlanta, what he told me was this, and it stuck with me. And he said, there are 35-year-olds getting elected all across the country. Hope you know that. And I was like, okay. He said, and particularly in cities of your size and in cities in the South. And he said, someone that you should research and read up on is Maynard Jackson in Atlanta, the first, I think, African-American mayor of Atlanta, and what it took to become mayor and what it means for your city to be mayor as well. He said, your election is a reflection of where your city wants to go. And if you ignore that, then you're missing all the clues on what could help you govern as a mayor. And so I embraced that advice. it is, I have to say, I thought I had I thought I knew a lot about politics and government by being in state government, but I'm definitely learning my PhD now in local government, because it's where the rubber meets the road. And in Richmond, it meets the road pretty hard. Thank you.
Thank you guys all so much for asking those wonderful questions. And thank you, Mayor
Thank
Stoney,
you.
for all of your service to the City of Richmond, for being here.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. We have a gift that we want to present to you.
Oh, gift.
Yeah, just to thank you for.
Under $50.
There you go. That's, yeah, that's that one.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Now I have the pleasure of introducing Bill Anthalis, who is the director and CEO of the Miller Center. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Miller Center, this is where we are here today. And so hopefully you have at least some familiarity. It's a nonpartisan affiliate of the University of Virginia that specializes in presidential scholarship, public policy, and political history. Like this event today, they host many different programs and functions that deeply enrich our university community. After Dr. Anthalis earned his BA in Government and Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia in 1986, he decided to come back to the university, and because he was an undergrad here, he's no stranger to the unique student culture here. Because of the ways he deeply cares about this community, and particularly the students, it has been my pleasure to get to know Bill over the past 4 years. Whether it was brainstorming ways to get more students involved in Miller Center programming in his office, or eating pizza at his home downtown with 11 other students as he helped prepare us to go on a trip to Hong Kong, by sharing some of his cultural insights that he garnered while he was doing research for his book, Inside Out, India and China, Local Politics Go Global. My interactions with him, and I think I speak for other students when I say this, have absolutely enriched my university experience here. Before returning to UVA to lead the Miller Center in 2014, Dr. Anthalis served as the managing director at the Brookings Institution and previously held multiple senior official positions in the Clinton administration. He, like the Honorable Mayor Stoney, will be sharing some thoughts on how the average American citizen can impact democracy. Dr. Anthalis cares deeply about this issue, and I'm sure will have many profound thoughts to share with us. One thing that really sticks out to me is that only 5 years after graduating from UVA with his bachelor's, he founded the Civic Education Project in 1991. So I'm really excited to hear what he has to share with us today, and without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Bill Anthalis.
Well, thank you, Maeve, for that kind introduction. It's been a great joy for me to get to know Maeve and her colleagues, but particularly Maeve, who we partnered with shortly after I arrived. But also thanks to Sarah, Liam, and Avery for the work that you all put into today. I was very inspired to hear what you all had in mind. And then to Mayor Stoney, as Maeve mentioned, and I actually sort of forgot, I did write this book about local politics. It's now been 5 years ago, but mayors really do change the world. And in these big places that we always hear about as sort of threatening or they're going to come and take over the world, the most inspiring things happening in India and China are not the things that their big, powerful heads of state are doing. In fact, they're all scrambling to try to figure out how to deal with these mayors and governors who are challenging them every day. I say to people, if you're worried about China taking over the world, the head of state in China is worried about how he can control the mayors who are totally going off the radar screen and doing completely corrupt things, or how he can channel the mayors that are really doing great and exciting and ambitious things. So it's a pleasure to be with the mayor. And in fact, as the mayor was speaking, I thought about one of my favorite presidential quotes, which is completely relevant today. Teddy Roosevelt once wrote that it's not the critic, the academic, the scholar who counts. The credit belongs. Now, I've pulled this up because I shared it with my daughters. So I've changed it a little bit. The credit belongs to the woman who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes up short again and again. The mayor shared his own experience in that regard. Because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends herself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if she fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that her place shall never be with the cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. So as you think about this big question, how do we fix our democracy? I think it was perfect to hear the mayor talk about study those who have failed. The ancients defined citizenship as those who rule and who are ruled in turn. In every democracy, there's a contest. And it's as important to understand what happens when you lose, or if you're just simply a voting citizen and you've won and you've elected somebody, how you cede responsibility in the active mode, but how you watch, not in a passive mode, but in the role of one who is governed. So that's a framework to start with. Here at the Miller Center, we've been thinking a lot about our own research on the presidency, and we've been working in partnership with the college to look at what we think are the big questions in democracy. So I want to talk a little bit, just for a few minutes, about what the big questions we're asking are and what that says to citizens. We at the Miller Center think about it in three big categories for what presidents have learned when they've come to big decision points. We call them crossroads. In three big areas: institutions, how presidents relate to the public, to the people, and how presidents relate to policy. On the institution side, institutions are really important things. They are not just buildings, they're not just empty vessels, they're laws. They are the things to which, in a free society, the things that allows citizens to rule and be ruled in turn. In a free society, an institution is that which a citizen agrees to do regardless of whether or not they are in power. Right? That's what a law is. A law is a rule that you freely accept to be governed by. And our institutions essentially vest that power in other individuals, either by electing them, by selecting and confirming them. There's a way in which people are placed responsible for institutions. There is a lack of faith in our institutions today. We've seen declining faith in government for a number of different reasons. So in the article that Sarah mentioned about 34, 36, 38 ways to fix our democracy, there's a whole bunch of things on institutions there. How we elect people, what they do when they're in government. There are things about changing the Congressional Budget Office. That's an institution. I think in all of these places, the beating heart of that is that these are rules that we are willing to be governed by. If the institution's not working, it's because we've lost faith in that institution's ability to govern us. So rather than complain about the institution, take responsibility for fixing it. The second category is what we call president and the people. What we've been talking about in the college has two different dimensions. One is citizenship itself, and the second is how we communicate, the media. So on citizenship itself, huge debates obviously going on about who is a citizen, what is a citizen. Immigration is just one of those, the role of historically underprivileged, under-resourced, whether it's by race or ethnicity or religion or gender. In all of those, I think the simple beating heart of the question that whether you're Democrat or Republican, conservative, liberal, libertarian, I think we should all agree to is not just rights of citizenship, but responsibilities of citizenship. If you are going to allow someone to be a citizen, what are we asking of them in return? What do they give back? In their moment of active citizenship, of being in the arena, what do we expect of them? If you can ask and expect somebody to do something, then you can confer on them a right. Separate from that, the media. There is growing decline in fact, on the scales of public faith in various institutions, our governing institutions. People don't ask about faith in citizenship, it turns out. We don't ask whether we trust one another. But we do ask about faith in the media, and that's also in decline. And here, what does it mean to be a responsible teller of truth? And that applies as much to CNN or MSNBC or Fox News as to any one of us when we use one of these. What does it mean to be responsible in posting on Facebook or on Twitter or on Snapchat? I watch my own kids and I ask them this question. They are quite surprised, for instance, to hear that there's any scandal at all about Facebook sharing data. They actually assume that all of their data is out there. But they do occasionally show umbrage when I ask to see what they just posted on Snapchat. So I think we do have to think about these media as trusted sources of information. The reason that, and I was reminded that Mayor Stoney was born the year before I started as an undergraduate at the University of Virginia. Back then, it was the Washington Post or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, and there really weren't that many other choices, except the Cavalier Daily. Back then, it was the University Journal and the Daily News and the Declaration, or the Daily Progress or the Declaration. Those were the options you had in Charlottesville. And on all of them, though they varied in political persuasion and audience, you knew someone was editing the thing that you were reading. That's what made it trusted and trustworthy. Nobody edits this. So in that moment where we can communicate with one another without filter, how do we govern ourselves? How do we filter ourselves? That, for me, is the big question there. Finally, policy. I won't talk too long about this. Maybe we can go into this in the question and answer. But we divide that into economic policy and or domestic policy and foreign policy. On the domestic policy side, I think the key word that Democrats and Republicans have learned to agree on is opportunity. How do we create a society where any person from whatever means and backgrounds has an opportunity to engage, to contribute, but the key about opportunity is also to be governed. How do we build a society where people feel because they have a chance to rise politically or economically or socially, that rising doesn't exempt them from the laws, but makes them subject to the laws? And then finally, on foreign policy, we're living in a time and a moment where suddenly there's a great rise of concern about a foreign government having invaded our political process, and I feel that personally. And also a time where there's a question about whether America still believes in a world led by liberal democracies and led by the United States itself. And I feel that myself, but I think in that context too, we have to ask ourselves, both across our history and today, when we engage, when we promote and support democracy abroad, are we doing it in a way that has the interests in mind of the people, not that we're governing, but that we're partners with? Are we doing this in support of true democracies abroad? Are we willing to listen to them? Are we willing to lead not just by example, but willing to lead by listening to others' concerns, by partnership? So when I think about the big challenges, and when we here at the Miller Center think about the big challenges facing us, we think about them in these three areas with a few subparts. Presidents and the Constitution, that is our institutions, presidents and the people, how we relate to one another as citizens, and presidents and policy, both on the domestic and foreign side. What makes us special? What makes democracy worth fighting for? So with that, questions and answers.
We'll take 3 to 4 questions if anyone has questions. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Anthalis. Thank you for coming to speak with us. We really appreciate it. My name's Elena Robinson. I'm a third year at UVA. So I know in your talk you talked a lot about restoring faith in our institutions, specifically talking about the role of citizens and how they can restore faith. But I was also wondering what you think about Congress today in terms of the hyper-partisanship and polarization. And it seems like politics now is a zero-sum game, as Mayor Stoney talked about earlier. So given your experience in presidential history and congressional history, what are your thoughts on how we can move forward in tackling these key issues, whether that's immigration or affordable housing or just voting rights in general? Thank you.
Boy, that's a big, complicated question, but I think I remember recently seeing public faith in Congress is somewhere just above exterminators, but just below journalists. Okay, that sort of frames it for you, doesn't it? There are a number of different reasons for that. I think part of that is the way members of Congress are selected, and then I think it's the way they've selected to govern themselves, not just as individuals and how they conduct themselves, but how they manage their institution and manage their relations with the president, with the courts, and elsewhere. The selection of members of Congress is big and complicated, right? It's really, at some level, controlled in a way that we don't think about by states. States draw the lines of congressional districts. Do they make those districts internally competitive between the two parties, or do they make them safe for parties? So in states like Iowa, where you've had independent commissions draw the boundaries of congressional districts, to make them be as competitive between the parties in each district, what you get are members of Congress from those districts who tend to move toward the middle, because they know when they're fighting in their primary, the primary Republican voter in Iowa, if he or she is a Republican, knows that whoever they select still has to do real battle in a general election with a Democrat. And they're likely to select somebody that's going to be more drawn to appealing to wider audiences. So when that Iowa member of Congress is sent to Congress, that's somebody that has to appeal to moderate voters back at home and is more likely to work with other moderate members of Congress in Congress. And the same applies to Democrats from Iowa and from every other state that has those that sort of philosophy in designing the congressional districts. That is a huge part of the way this works. Political scientists have gone back and forth on saying how big a part it is. For a while, a decade ago, they swung in the direction of saying, actually gerrymandering is a bit overstated. But I think what the record shows is that members of Congress are far more polarized than the American people. The American people are starting to polarize because of the media and other things. But for the first time in the last 70 years, going back to the end of World War II, we now have in the Senate, for instance, not the House of Representatives, in the Senate, the most liberal Republican and the most conservative Democrat are separate from one another. It used to be that liberal Republicans were to the left of conservative Democrats, and that's no longer the case. And in the House of Representatives, it's as bad, if not worse. There are a few that overlap because of a couple strange districts, but it's extraordinary to see the weight of that. So, for instance, if after the midterm elections a Democrat is to win, almost certainly a Democratic-run House of Representatives will be, the center of gravity will be pretty far left in the political spectrum. They will have won, however, because of a tidal wave of support for moderate Democrats who are beating probably moderate Republicans in contested districts. So you'll have a Democratic caucus that is as divided as the current Republican caucus. And it's those internal divisions of those two caucuses that makes the Congress, both in the House and the Senate, so difficult to manage. Because the Speaker of the House or the Senate Majority Leader is not really working on behalf of the whole Senate or the whole House of Representatives, where there's probably a majority in the middle. They first have to manage their caucus, and their caucus is weighted heavily to the left if you're a Democrat and heavily to the right if you're a Republican. So we may get angry at particular members of Congress. They're a mosaic of 435 in the House and 100 in the Senate. And the challenge is in these broader set of institutions that manage that. So how do we fix the institutions? And I think it really comes back, and it's a shame that the mayor has left us now, it really comes back to our state houses drawing congressional lines in a way that reflects the American people in a much more way. And we're coming up on that. We're going to have a census soon, right? We're coming up on the 2020 census. The 2020 census will determine how congressional lines are drawn in the next for the Congresses in the 2020s, and it's really important to get that right.
Thank you, by the way, for coming to speak to us, Dr. Antholis. My question.
Thank you for coming here. It was very easy. I just had to walk downstairs.
So my question is about how, as we move further into the 21st century, the Asian American population appears to be growing significantly. However, in discussions about issues, even ones that particularly affect the Asian American community, such as affordable housing and immigration, the community is never really brought up. Do you see this changing in the future? And if not, why has there been a lack of, say, Asian representation in our government?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question that I have only a little bit of insight on, but it comes from having traveled and lived in Asia for about 6 months, and through that lens, getting to understand the Asian community in the United States. I think the Asian American community is about 3%. As the electorate stands, it's about 4% because they actually turn out and vote, and they're overrepresented proportionally to their size of the population. I mean, the biggest challenge for the Asian American community, that's such a pan description of an enormous part of the planet that happens to be represented in a small way here. So, you know, within the Asian American community, you have Chinese and Indians and Southeast Asians and other South Asians, and they don't commonly identify around some things. Yet there are some common identifiers for them. They tend to be relatively well educated. They have placed, as a general matter, a high emphasis on education. They tend to be urban and not suburban, although they're increasingly becoming suburban. They don't tend to be particularly affluent. We are seeing recent waves of Asian immigration at the lower but rising levels of socioeconomic development, because they don't tend to identify as Asian, but instead of their subcultures, they don't identify with one another as much. So they don't tend to self-organize as a 4% voting bloc. The things that I do think that you will start to see them care about if their experiences in major urban settings has been the same, they have organized around schools, which many recent immigrant groups tend to organize. That's a good thing. Public housing, or housing more broadly. I mean, I think we've seen public housing fade as an issue, but issues around housing, everything from mortgages to zoning and school districts as it relates to housing, will become a higher priority. And then finally, transportation becomes an issue. What we're seeing with, for instance, the suburbanization of poverty, which often impacts recent Asian families. If you live in Arlington, Virginia, and you're a recent Asian immigrant family making $35,000 to $40,000 a year, and you're a multi-child family, so you're on the edge of poverty, public transportation ends up being a huge issue. And to the extent that groups organize around that at the local level, they can have real impact. Mm-hmm.
So my question pertains to social media. And as you're talking about how there's very little regulation in kind of the truth behind social media, you know, we kind of refer to it colloquially as like fake news, right? What do you see as kind of like the benefit and harm of social media, you know, particularly in the Middle East? You know, we've seen the power of the spread of information through social media, but also the harm that can be inherent in fake news spreading through it. Do you see social media as something that is a danger, or perhaps like a strong and beneficial tool for democracy?
Like almost all technologies, whether it's nuclear or artificial intelligence, you know, the media and social, individually empowered media technologies we've created, I think, are neutral. They're ways of connecting with one another. everything, I won't repeat everything you said because I think you've roughly framed it in the right way, and I gave you my sense of editing, but I'll add one more layer to this. The data that comes from social media that we started to see through the Cambridge Analytica stuff, the big data from social media is itself both a powerful tool and something to be careful about. So I'll just give it to you from the perspective of somebody that runs an organization like this or works with colleagues here to run particular parts of it. We're data hungry. We want to know how many people are watching everything from this event to big events that we do. We did one in the Tom Tom Festival this week. And we don't want to know just how many people, but who's watching, where are they from, who are they? And the more data I can have about them, the better. And that's dangerous. Because depending on what I do with that data, I'm either a very strategically focused political entrepreneur, or I'm invading somebody's privacy and using them for different ends. So for us, I want to collect as much data as possible. When you come to, when Mayor Stoney's successor, who starts reading presidential biographies on our website, comes to our website and reads the biographies of the 45 presidents, we now ask them to self-identify who they are. We want to sign them up. We want to keep them. We want to stay connected to them. I have to be incredibly careful about how I use that data. Do I share it with anybody? Do I have their permission to share it? Can I track their viewing habits? I want to know how long they're staying on our website, how long they're reading those articles. What do I do with that information? We have to police and govern ourselves because we have a responsibility to the public and to that person to be careful about that data. So, I see social media and these social technologies to include things like emails and websites, and the data you share, the information you share about your travels on the internet are really powerful for me as an organization, but I have to be very careful about how I use that power.
Can I say something?
Please.
Bill knows that I'm on. Come ahead. Bill knows that I'm on the governing council here at Miller Center. But 20 years before that, I was one of the founders of the Sorensen Institute, which is right down the road here. And I'm interested in the kind of unstated inferences that politicians sometimes go bad. And I would just like to say that I've interviewed applicants for Sorensen, Democrats and Republicans, Greens, Browns, Yellows, and whatever. And they, without exception, when they first get into governance and politics, they are out to change the world. Absolutely no exception. And it's a wonderful, beautiful thing to see. It's just like this young man who stood up as mayor. He did exactly what, I was curious if you'd been to Sorensen, I have no idea, but I mean, that's a perfect example of the kind of people that happens when you're young and you believe in stuff. It doesn't matter what your politics are, your partisanship, it's you want to step up and you make a difference. And I would just encourage all of you to do it, because when you tell stories about Cory Booker and the other ones, some of them do well and some go to jail. That's the story, that's the end of the story. And the ones that go to jail, it's really kind of ugly. And sometimes we hear too much of that. But the vast majority of our elected officials are here and still are to serve. They get along fine with each other. It's a beautiful thing to watch if you ever get to know them at that level.
Thank you for that, Fred. I think that's very well stated, and I want to thank Fred as well, because there are so many different ways to serve. You can serve in your community. You can serve by helping guide and support organizations of all different kinds. Fred has been a leader here, but there are so many different ways that you can lead in other organizations, and that counts. So the mayor is, I think, is a terrific example, and running for public office is something that I've never been courageous enough to do. But there are other ways to serve as well and to be in the arena. And so, and I want to thank Fred and acknowledge him for his service in our little arena here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Antholis. If we give him a round of applause as well. And we also have a gift for you, so thank you very much.
Well, and thank you again for choosing us to be your home for today's event.
Of course.
Not just because I only had to walk down the stairs to participate. So.
Well, thank you again. Now we will move into a panel discussion. And to introduce our panel, we have Ellen Yates and Elena Robinson from Student Council. So come on up.
In late September of 2016, before the presidential election, Jane Brady Knight sent an email to a group of young professionals in New York City that said America is in need of a leadership crisis. No matter what happens with this election, it is now our generation's time to take our future into our own hands. We must see our reality as an opportunity for creation, innovation, and collaboration. Americans, especially millennials, are politically homeless. Let us provide these Americans with a platform they can truly believe in. Only one person responded, Wyatt Melzer. Jane Brady and Wyatt met for what turned out to be a 3-hour discussion over their shared concern about the direction of the country they would inherit. However, they left with mutual optimism and encouragement from the potential of America's next generation of changemakers. Over the next year, Jane Brady and Wyatt worked to form a platform for a broad movement of citizens who are rooted in America's fundamental values and inclusive traditions to enter politics. They officially launched the Modern American Party, also known as MAP, in December 2017. MAP is the new party for the modern American. They focus on a culture of organic growth and innovation that embraces modern solutions to age-old problems. MAP offers a 21st century political platform that is pro-free enterprise, pro-human choice, and centered on restoring the voice of moral clarity, human values, and our faith in the American dream.
Good afternoon, everyone. So it's going to be my distinct pleasure to introduce Pierce Godwin. So Pierce is founder and CEO of the Listen First Project. He leads the Listen First movement to mend the frayed fabric of America by bridging divides, one conversation at a time. Pierce studied public policy, economics, and business at Duke University and is currently pursuing his MBA at UNC Chapel Hill. He spent 5 years working in Washington, D.C., and first in the U.S. Senate and as a national political consultant conducting voter market and political messaging analysis for presidential and also statewide campaigns. Before moving to his home in North Carolina in 2013, Pierce spent 6 months in Uganda, Africa, where he wrote "It's Time to Listen." That message, printed in dozens of papers across the United States, launched the Listen First Project and led to thousands to sign the Listen First Pledge. In August 2017, as division turned to violence in Charlottesville, Virginia, and across the country, Pierce left his marketing job, fully committed to turn the tide of rising rancor and deepening division with his Listen First message. And now Pierce is focused on leading a culture-changing Listen First movement with major events and community and school engagements. And the first National Week of Conversations, which he's kicking off next week in Charlottesville, Virginia, with the National Week of Conversation. Which is next Friday through Sunday, so you should all come out to see it. So it's been an honor to introduce Pierce and thinking about his really critical and life-changing work, not only here in the United States, but internationally. And I really look forward to hearing the conversation, both with Pierce and Wyatt and Jane, and just hearing what they have to contribute to how to fix democracy in America today. So if you guys could all come up to the panel, and thank you all. So.
Thank you all for joining us today. Again, we're incredibly excited to have you to talk about democracy. Firstly, to introduce myself, my name is Liam Wolf. I'm a fourth-year student at the University of Virginia and have been directing this project, the How to Fix American Democracy project, here on grounds. So to begin, if you all would like to tell us who you are and maybe describe a little bit how you came to be where you are today. Pierce is the founder of the Listen First Project, and Wyatt and Jane Brady as the founders of the Modern American Party. So Pierce, if you'd like to begin.
Sure. the whole crowd's already against me. I have 2 shades of blue, neither of which are acceptable. But like it was shared, I spent several years up in D.C. and then had the opportunity to go over and spend a few months in Uganda back in 2013. And it certainly gave me a fresh perspective. And that perspective ended up being manifest as I was looking back at my home state of North Carolina. And that particular summer, we were at each other's throat down there in the Triangle. And I had left D.C. and thought I was returning to real America, where all we do is say, bless your heart, and we all get along, right? Isn't that how this is supposed to go? Just kidding. But with that perspective, this vitriol, this demagoguery of those with whom we disagree just felt particularly inane. So much so that I got all frustrated about it and started writing some thoughts down. And that ended up just being a blog that went on, that went on Facebook, and then, frankly, we were off to see some animals on safari before coming home. But somebody said, hey, kind of an interesting message, why don't you share it with a newspaper? I've never thought of that before. And Raleigh News and Observer, and then as was mentioned, a number of other papers across the country shared it. So there's nothing brilliant about this idea. I should have learned it in kindergarten. I did not. But listening first to understand those with whom we disagree. And it was resonating. And so then, said, well, let's do something about it. Let's start Listen First Project. And as was mentioned, that was Pierce in his pajamas for about 4 years there. And then the events here in this community just totally changed my own calculus about my desire to commit full-time to this, but how would that ever be feasible? That kind of didn't matter anymore once we saw marches escalating to murder, and this epitomizing the division that we're seeing across the country. And I can share, more of that perspective, but that's enough for the introduction. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I'm Wyatt. I'm actually I'm a graduate of the University of Virginia. I graduated here in 2012. So some of you that are here are alumni. I am biased, but I think it's one of the best places in the world. A Friday afternoon in Charlottesville like today is what it's all about. So thank you for having us. I appreciate it. Seriously, I was very emotional coming in today. I was about to cry the whole morning because I love this place. But I think there's a lot of ways to take why you start a political party, but I'll try to be precise in terms of kind of the moment I realized that I think I needed to do more with my life and to try to build a platform that was going to make a difference. And I helped establish a nonprofit program in Harlem, New York, that teaches lacrosse to inner city youth. It's called Harlem Lacrosse. And I truly believe, I was born with, if you're born with 10 qualities to be successful, I was probably born, thankfully, I don't take it for granted, but probably 8.5 or 9 of them. And I had a life growing up where my parents were there for me, and I had a car when I was 16, and I went to a great high school and a great college, and I didn't have any worries in life. And I go to Harlem, and I'm in a classroom with 35 boys, and they're all inner city kids and all below the poverty rate and all coming from single parent or zero parent homes and all on welfare. And I looked around and I said, I just didn't think it was fair that I was born into a positive environment that was conducive to success across the board, and based off of where these kids were born, they couldn't be successful in life because of, I believe, the failures of what's going on in our country today. And I said, there's got to be a better way to help more deserving kids across the country. And I feel like both parties right now, I don't feel like are doing what's necessary to solve the real problems of our country. And I think a lot of it starts in the inner cities. A lot of it starts, most importantly, with education. And I was dying to connect with like-minded individuals who were thinking this amount of craziness on a daily level. I know it wasn't something that a lot of my friends, I was living in New York at the time, weren't really consumed about. And so I was a sucker for connecting with people who wanted to change the world, as our friend said in the back. And I'm one of the people that hopefully can be a part of that movement to put this thing on the right track. And I think a big thing in life is taking chances on opportunities, and this crazy lady sent me an email a couple years ago, and it was right up my alley, and we've been hitting the ground running ever since, and kind of the co-founder of this Modern American Party, and my title is Chief Change Maker. So we're trying to change even how people think about their titles and their roles. So I'll shut up now, but that's it.
He's really good at talking. My title is Chief Thinker, and I'm more of the one who sits back and goes deep into thought. Yeah, tell him what to do. But
we're also engaged, by the way, in case you guys are wondering. So
if there's back and forth.
A lot going on here.
Yeah. I'm Jane Brady Knight, and I am originally from Lexington, Kentucky. I went to Davidson College, and I graduated in 2016. Throughout my professional careers, I was a political science major, so throughout my professional careers, I was trying to understand where my best fit was in the realm of politics in that world. I went and worked for Fox News special reports with Bret Baier, and I was there when ISIS hit hard and really came to the forefront of what it means to have a war on terror and the war of ideas. And this was during our World Cup when they beheaded someone and put it on Twitter and said, "This is our trophy." Fox News called all of the associates in and asked them to find the tweet, and then proceeded to make a documentary that its sole narrative was, how do we blame this on Obama? And I realized how I was not going to fit into the news cycle. And I started, it was a realization of, okay, this is real world politics. Our politics have been hijacked by extreme factions, and these factions are getting into people's minds. And it's not clear necessarily where our parties stand because we don't have clarity with people who are delivering messages. So then I went to work on the Hill, and I thought, well, maybe I can fit in there. No, but I had the pleasure for working for Speaker Boehner, and had a one-on-one meeting with him where he told me something that really stuck with me. He said, the biggest problem with American politics today, and this was during the rise of the Tea Party, is that we are now two opposition parties, and we are not an alternative solution. There's no one here offering an alternative solution. There are two parties yelling at each other. So I, in turn, went to go work at a think tank where I could just think about all the things that I had learned. And I worked at the American Enterprise Institute and the Manhattan Institute. And then during the presidential election, I realized that none of these fits were my best fit. And through these experiences, I realized that a majority of Americans right now really feel politically homeless. So what can we do to provide that platform where people can feel confident in labeling themselves under a belief system and feeling like their vote has a voice? So I sent an email, and he responded. He was forwarded the email, and now we're co-founders and engaged.
And more.
And more.
No escaping.
Right, well, thank you for your responses. And to kind of launch into it, I'd love to hear from you all. What do you see as being the biggest issue facing American democracy in 2018? I mean, clearly it sounds like partisanship is something that kind of unites both of you and the work that you're doing. But yeah, please give your thoughts. Jim, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, of course. I actually don't think it is partisanship that is the biggest problem. I think parties are necessary in democracy. I think they provide a belief system, and they promote the sharing of ideas, especially different ideas. I think what's missing is collaboration and conversation and healthy debate in order to work towards a compromise. I think what's also missing is the fact that we are in a leadership crisis. There is no clear leader to the superpower of the entire world. And when we are in this state, we don't necessarily have that voice of moral clarity that's not only just on a national platform, it's no longer on an international platform. So it does turn into a zero-sum game internationally.
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, there's a lot to pick, and I think that's the thing, is that we are entering this world that there's so much information we're consuming on a daily basis, and you go on social media for 5 minutes and you scroll through your Twitter or whatever it may be, there's 50 issues that are at the forefront of where you should be focused on, and it's local, state, national, and world issues that everyone is saying, this is the one you need to focus on, this is the one you need to donate, I think it's just a saturated market of issues right now. So I think the issue is there's too many issues. And our generation, I think younger generations, is really trying to figure out, where do I go? What do I do? Which one do I focus on? And I think we need, like Jane said, a leader to say, let's knock out education, let's get this back on track, or how about let's get healthcare on, let's get one issue done, because I think the power of our country and the power of younger generations, specifically with social media and technology and our ability to communicate, you can knock out education in 24 hours. I mean, I say that boldly, but you could make a dent in the education system if we said, here's a leader and we're sticking to one thing and we're going with it. So I think overall it's just a saturated issue market is what we're dealing with right now.
Mm-hmm. I wasn't expecting to hear profanity on this panel, but then Jane went and used the dirty C word, compromise. A few points that I've pulled together in the last few days for a column with some neat data that is really stark. So my thought in focusing on the conversation, as you said, Jane, is that the United States is honestly in a crisis right now. Now, a lot of us have our own different views of what that crisis is, certainly who is to blame for that crisis, but we're all agreeing that something is terribly wrong. And we have survey data to back it up. We know that 75% of Americans say that this problem of demagoguing one another, they call it incivility. I'm on a bit of a strategic rant against that word, but that's neither here nor there. It doesn't work for everybody. But 75% say this problem has reached a crisis level. And it's not just that I disagree with Sarah. I'm actually more likely to dislike, distrust, even despise you because you see the world differently. And this issue of our different positions becoming true animosity and disdain for the individual is what people a lot smarter than I am call affective polarization, right? So we've all talked about polarization, especially in the political sphere. Great, we're in different sides of an issue. I don't know that that's inherently bad. It's not particularly productive to governance, but there's nothing necessarily inherently wrong about being far apart on an issue. But it's this affective polarization that I think is cause for alarm, where those differences and disagreements have become so personal as we are raging against and recoiling from anybody who doesn't see the world the way we do. Pew Research has found that we now fear those on the other side. Now they're focused on politics. I like to make it a bit broader than that, but we're fearing those on the other side. They have this hilarious question where it's on a thermometer from 0 to 100. How do you feel about the Republicans? Or how do you Republican feel about the Democrats? Bipartisan agreement. Slightly off, 23 degrees, 24 degrees, but that's how we're feeling. That's the coldness with which we're viewing the other side. Pew says that most of us have just a few or no friends on the other side, as I would say more broadly, but in the opposition political party. And Washington Post says a majority of us don't see that many things anymore that bind us together as Americans, far fewer than in the past. So just for a moment on the election, I know this is a big news flash, I'll wait for the gasp, but 75% of us thought the last presidential election was uncivil. According to this survey, another 79% said these kind of uncivil comments by political leaders are encouraging greater incivility in society. And 3/4 of us want to say, oh, it's those politicians, right? It's those crazy people we've interacted with in D.C. But I do honestly think, without being cliche, that we the people have the opportunity to make the change, that we can be the change we believe in. I personally am not terribly optimistic that it's going to come from the top down. I think the only way it happens, and the more likely way it happens, is from the bottom up. So you mentioned Brett Barry. He's been an early kind of champion and graciously talked about Listen First and tweeted about it, and that's cool. He has more followers than I do. But so to the extent we have some people, some politicians, 2 or 3 dozen now have signed the Listen First pledge, and we're recognizing them as Listen First leaders or candidates. Great, wonderful. Take all the help we can get. But I really do think it's up to us from the grassroots to make that change. I think the future of our democracy is at stake, and that it's time for us to do something about it. I smile a lot. I'm not much of a Chicken Little kind of guy. But I really don't think that our society, that our democracy can survive in this current state. But the note of hope I'll end on, I do think in today's hyperpolarized and tribal society, we can turn the tide of rising rancor and deepening division simply by listening to those with whom we disagree. And each person who does that, each person who adopts that pledge, whether it is, hey, look at that cool bracelet Sarah's wearing, whether it is at the event in a week at Listen First in Charlottesville, Mike Reingold, some of you know, he was like, hey, you need bracelets. Okay, I need bracelets. So now we have bracelets. Adopting that pledge, each person who does that, I think, tips the tide towards a new direction for society, a stronger country in which it is based on the relationships that are built through conversation.
Thank you both. Let's turn to young people. What do you see as being the biggest issue of disillusionment with young people with civic engagement in our political process? And how do you see improved civic engagement among the youth? What do you think are some effective strategies to improve civic engagement among young people? Start with Wyatt this time.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we say you got to make politics cool, innovative, and transparent. So I think when you look at the current political parties, I think a majority of younger generations say old, corrupt, and boring. And I think it's time to put a little innovation. I think, as Jane alluded to earlier, younger generations look to technology for solutions and look to technology for answers and look to people that are leading in those fields as the leaders of our country. And I think technology is such an important part of our lives, for the better or for worse. And I think infusing innovation and technology from simple things such as crowdfunding platforms and using Venmo to get people to give money to, and using Slack and Asana for communication. I mean, simple tasks. We're not talking about flying around in flying cars yet, but I think it's important to infuse technology to capture younger generations who don't understand how those things used to work, and saying there's better ways, more efficient ways to make this happen.
Pierce?
Yeah, it's so deeply unattractive, I think, to all of us, especially perhaps the younger generations who aren't perhaps hardened to it yet. Oh, that's just the way it is. Some of us, and I'm still going to count myself, even though I'm skipping my 10-year reunion to be here this weekend. Go Who's. We are not, we're growing up and saying, nah, this doesn't make sense. This isn't right. It doesn't have to be that way. So I think there's that activist nature that we all seem to have caught the bug, that wants to affect some sort of change. But so many people, and I'm sure the Miller Center and Duke Paulus and others want that engagement, but it's not a lot of fun. So some of the people that we might think would be the most effective politicians are saying no thanks, because of this vitriol, because of this interpersonal rancor that we're experiencing. So I think we're going to have amongst the younger generation and all generations, people to step forward and look to affect that change. So there'll be some brave ones who are willing to weather the current storm and just mess, and then hopefully they'll make it a little more attractive to others. But it's still going to require young generations and every generation stepping up and saying some of the things we're pointing out isn't how it's going to be. And when I talk to students, I always point out that this is math. The young people are going to be society in the future, right? So when we talk about our school engagements and Listen First chapters and all this kind of thing, it's the idea of fostering a new generation of Listening First leaders who, by definition, will replace what we have today, and hopefully the generations that follow will be more on that bandwagon as well.
Yeah, I think it's also just changing the dialogue. I think we've forgotten that government has a responsibility that a lot of other industries cannot fulfill. And that is the most beautiful thing about our democracy, is that it defends itself and it defends us with the job that it does on its own. And I think we've forgotten with everything, especially when it comes to how much freedom we are allowed with the democracy that we have, that it's bigger than us. Everything that happens is bigger than us. It's not, our generation is very self-focused, and sometimes we have to take a step back and think, yes, politics might be old, corrupt, and boring, but if we want to actually be the change, then we have to realize that there is sacrifice you have to make, and it's bigger than you, it's bigger than us, it's everyone. We're a world citizen before I believe that we are an American citizen. And because we are an American citizen and because we are allotted so many rights because of our freedom, and we are the freest country in the world, we have to portray that on a world stage in order for other people to share the same opportunities.
Thank you.
Can I just echo real quick?
Oh, yes, please.
That was awesome. I think you hit on something really important, Jane, which is it's bigger than us, any of us as an individual. So there's got to be some sort of common purpose. And I think too many of us, myself included, are so focused on what I'm focused on right now, what I believe right now. We're not opening ourselves up with any sort of humility to, gain an understanding or engage in the conversation. But more importantly, if there's not a higher purpose, then there's not much incentive for us to work together. Never mind with people with whom we're different. So that's a really important point. It's got to be more than just me in order to affect change for the country as a whole.
Thank you all. One final question from me before we open it up to some audience questions. The theme of the event being how can we fix American democracy? I'd like to hear your opinions on how can the average American make an impact on our American democracy.
I'll go. I think, realizing that it's bigger than just you and that you aren't right all the time.
Stop it.
Yeah, right? I know. I wish I was right all the time. I'd win all the arguments. But he learned fast.
How did this become a couch all of a sudden?
I think providing incentives for people to have discussion and meet in the middle, and understanding that it is collaboration that makes change and brings change and then actually enacts change is the most important thing. In order to collaborate, you have to let down your barriers. You have to show some vulnerability and the fact that you might not be right all the time. So I think it's having conversation. I think it's listening. And I just think it's realizing that you are not the sole solution. You have to have help, and we can be the change.
Yeah, I would say, I echo that. I would say I think we just need to take a deep breath as a country and as an individual, and honestly just a deep breath and say, we're okay, we're gonna be fine, we're the freest country in the world, and we have a lot of people that wanna do this the right way, and the younger generation I feel like is on the right track, and this doesn't happen overnight, and I think we are in a world that is consumed by immediate results and immediate justification and validation towards likes and messaging, and we put stuff, gratification, if we put stuff on social media and we don't get so many likes, have we failed? Have we not been successful? Or does it just take more time? And I think that's what the frustration is with everything going on in our country, is that it's swaying back and forth, and we're not able to see the long-term process validate itself, that it's just an immediate flip every few years of things we're doing. So I guess to answer your question, Liam, I'd say what we need to do to fix American democracy is take a deep breath and continue to move forward. And I think we know, and I don't, it's not just all about young generations, it's as every generation I think knows that we need to do more. And that's simply by showing up to this event, and that's simply by maybe telling a friend about a group that you've heard about today or this week or whatever it may be. I think it's one person at a time, but we're not going to fix it tomorrow, and it didn't break overnight. It seemed like it did in the 2016 presidential election, but that was a long time coming, and I think it's the best thing that's ever probably happened to our country, and I think it's putting us back on the right track, and I think we'll be okay if we keep moving forward.
That's awesome. I love the hopeful message. I know a lot of us millennials are probably used to saying, hey, that's cute, you and your pie in the sky idea appears. Let's just all come together and sing Kumbaya. At least that's what my parents said. Now that I quit my job, they're a little more supportive. But anyway, I do think that's the answer, though. There's that iconic Margaret Mead quote that, a few people are the only thing that has ever changed anything. And so I truly believe, I already gave you this line, but each person who, whether it's National Week of Conversation, which was, as was mentioned, is kicking off a Listen First in Charlottesville next weekend, all those people are going to have an opportunity when they sign up. It's over 100 partners across the country. It's ridiculous. Are going to say, hey, do you agree to the Listen First pledge? That will take this many years and a lot farther than I could have ever imagined. But so many organizations out there, over 100 there and 60 in Listen First Coalition, are thinking about this. Not many of them are, well, some of them are young, but there's still a lot more room. You're invited to Listen First Coalition. But I really do think that each person who opens themselves up to the conversation, who humbles themselves, who realizes it's about more than just me right now, maybe there's something I could learn from you. Maybe I don't have it all figured out. Maybe I will disagree with you even more after our conversation. Great, wonderful. But at least I have any respect and understanding for where you're coming from. And the conversations are not being had. We're in our tribes, and it's us versus them. And if we could just keep that to ACC basketball, democracy would be a lot healthier.
Thank you all. And if anyone in the audience has questions, we'd be happy to take those now.
So I guess my question, I'll just ask one for each. So first I'll ask for listen first. So I think a lot of times the reason polarization persists is that's what works to get elected. Like in in 88, Dukakis intentionally ran no negative ads and he got wrecked. And so how are we going to foster a sense of not doing attack ads if the candidates that run attack ads are going to be the ones that win?
It's a little bit of a circular problem, right? And it, I mean, there are so many sticky issues here, and I don't think there's any easy answers. The first thing that comes to mind is the earlier point that I think you articulate beautifully, why it's got to be from the bottom up. Because as long as we, the electorate, are allowing, I don't want to sound like some conspiracy theorist, but as long as we are responding to that negative ad and allowing that ad to say, yeah, that person is the devil, then it's going to keep working. And as long as we, and this is just human nature, I'm not trying to say we're all horrific. A lot of it's human nature. It's more comfortable to hear what I already believe from people, somebody who's just like me, thinks just like me. It's just easier. I mean, it takes effort to have a mind-broadening conversation, to have my ideas challenged, never mind humility and all that other stuff. But somehow we have got to decide en masse, but one by one, that that's not going to fly, that we want a different kind of politics, and that we're not going to reward the politics that has worked and is empirically proven to work. So, again, doesn't happen overnight, but I think we, the people, are the ones that are going to have a different market demand, or else politicians, and not to disparage them, the comment was made earlier, lots of wonderful, wonderful people that want to serve the country, they also want to stay in office. And many of them will do what is effective to stay in office. And it's kind of on us whether that works or not, and whether that's what we allow and what we elect and what we perpetuate.
And then I guess from that point, my question would be about the logistics aspect. Just when you see political parties being made, like Republican Party when it first came to be, it was top down. It was a bunch of established figures that made a party and then ran people. And when you see third parties emerge that get significant votes, like it's Ross Perot's party, it's George Wallace's party, it's always tied to some group of or a key individual that created that party. So how can you go about, how are you going to find candidates, run candidates, when you're trying to build it from the bottom up?
That's her question.
Has it worked?
What?
Has it worked?
I mean, it worked for the Republican Party.
Yeah, it worked for the Republican Party when they overthrew the Whigs, right? Long time ago. Yes. Very antiquated. Both parties are very antiquated. And we aren't necessarily saying the two-party system is broken. We're saying the parties in themselves are hijacked by factions, that they're fundamentally broken. And so we are here to serve the new majority, which is the majority that meets in the middle. And we believe that every other party that has been established has been a big name. But I think our generation, the largest now voting bloc, is tired of big names. They're tired of big money. They've heard it all of their life, and it hasn't brought about the change that they actually want to see. And I think they want to see the change from themselves. And so we're offering that platform to say we're going to self-select policy from a group of Americans that actually represent the voting demographic, so we can start providing that platform for those who do identify in the middle, which is now America's new majority.
I would just say, to segue on kind of both those questions, because it's a similar viewpoint, is I don't think I worked on a guy who was running for mayor of New York City, so I try not to talk about anything that I didn't have a personal experience doing. I don't have any answers, but I have some experiences. So it was extremely frustrating. It's one of the reasons why I started my own party, because he was an independent Republican running against Bill de Blasio in New York City. And the people that we hired, who were these consultants, all they did was think that go against de Blasio, go against de Blasio, go against de Blasio. And I firmly believe that we could have won that election if we just produced some sort of idea and vision towards how to solve some local, very specific issues, such as the homeless crisis going on in New York City. I don't believe that Americans want this back and forth. We're tired of reality television, and that's what this has become. I mean, I believe that what's happening now is the definition of what our country's produced, which is an extreme reality television show that is turning into a nightmare. And I think Americans just want results. And so I think that starts on the local level. And I think Mayor Stoney was a great example. On a local level, as a mayor, you are fixing the problems. It's not this whole grand scheme of try to convince people that you are or aren't something. It's like, if you're fixing the pothole in front of my house, I want you to be my mayor. If you're fixing the homeless crisis, I want you to be the mayor. Like, if you're making my parks cleaner, I want you to be the mayor. So I think in terms of how do we stop this back and forth, I think we need to really get back into local politics. Like, we need to get back into local news and local newspapers, and we need to get back to local and stop thinking there's only 3 or 4 opinions out there that matter. Because long story short, I think this is our approach, and that's was the answer to the question, is like, people don't want this back and forth anymore. They want to feel like our country's moving forward in the right direction, and we're not. We're in this little bit of a limbo right now, no matter what side of things you agree or disagree with. And I think just getting back to solution-based problems is what Americans want, and that's what we want to offer. And our first platform is education, and we could probably spend the rest of our lives on just education, because it's that important, it's that needed, and I think it starts in education, it works itself out. And so focusing on one problem, if our whole life is just doing a little bit of a little dent in education, then maybe we've done our part. And I think that's the focus we need to have.
Let me throw some encouraging numbers on what you just said. So this Weber-Shandwick survey was called Civility in America. I've already told you that's a separate conversation. But 75% of us are willing to set a good example of civil conversations. 66% would encourage friends, family members, and colleagues to do the same. More than a third of Americans, I had some fun with some back and napkin math the other night, 36%, which is 90 million people, that's out of adults. I know we're all smart here, you can start doing the math. Surveys against adults. So anyway, 90 million people want to see a national campaign promoting this kind of behavior. So that's encouraging, right? And then I shared this in Charlotte a couple days ago, and somebody was like, where did you get that data? Because that doesn't square with everybody I'm seeing who's jumping down the other person's throat. And I think the answer to that, because it's a valid observation, is yes, we should do better. We should encourage these conversations. I'm already doing it, but oh my God, that girl Sarah, like, they need to do better. She needs to do better. So we don't have the humility and the self-recognition to realize that many of us, I sure as heck am, part of the problem. So I think that's where the disconnect is. Oh yeah, we're all for it. Let's do it. But we may not be seeing, the plank in our own eye, if you will. But that data is encouraging to me, that I think America is ready for, and we've all agreed, desperate for that conversation and the kind of work that you all are doing as well.
Me as well. You take one more question. It's a long question.
You. So I'm a little bit curious about moderates, people who identify as moderates, because we hear so much, in the political discourse about how polarized things are, and yet I'm always surprised by how often I hear people identify as moderates. And I'm a little bit curious, do you think people who are moderates are all defining themselves the same way? And do you think their voting patterns are actually reflecting that they're moderates? And also, how do you think the relationship is within one party between people who identify as moderates and people who are moving to the extreme?
Moderates is on the ideological spectrum, right? So we don't all have like a moderate calling card. But I have seen a lot of research on independence, and Charlie Cook, when I was in D.C., paying a lot more attention to these things than I am now. I believe it was 90% of independents decidedly lean one way or the other when it comes down to it. So to that part of the question, the kind of true independent is a much smaller block than you might think based on registration. As we know, I mean, North Carolina is, way overtook Republicans anyway. So independents are growing, but are they really independent? And I wonder if the same is true of moderates. Certainly, as we see, Pew's done a lot of work on this, the parties get farther and farther apart on the issues. They got some very compelling graphs. So that almost kind of creates a greater space for a moderate, because maybe you used to be, right down, not the middle, but kind of the core conservative, the core Republican, the core Democrat, and now you're like, whoa, where'd the parties go? I guess I'm moderate now. So as that gets more extreme, I think that can absolutely occur. For me, and Listen First strategically, there's this dance of you are absolutely going to want to show up at the conversation. I look forward to seeing you at Sprint Pavilion. There are some people, there are many people who are like, oh, heck no, that guy's there, nope, won't be there. And some of those other people will also just be disruptive and kind of blow up the conversation. So how do we, and I think this applies in your sense as well, how do we get beyond the choir, but maybe understand that today we're not going to have 100%. Today 100% are not ready to listen to the other side, are not ready to consider another position, to consider any sort of compromise approach. But get beyond those of us, probably many in this room, who are like, yeah, right on, let's do it. I think, and to the structural point, the moderates in their own party, they're being dominated, as was mentioned, by the factions. I mean, we can get on the whole gerrymandering thing, right? But so many of our members of Congress have zero existential interest in compromise and in doing anything that is talking to that other guy, lest somebody further to their whatever primary them. So that's tough in the intra-party, as you mentioned.
I mean, you can get into certain technicalities like gerrymandering, which is a huge technicality, and you can also get into ranked choice voting experiments in different cities, and allowing people to actually be an independent or a moderate, where their vote does not go to waste, and they can vote in a primary. So that's a really important experiment we're seeing going on. I know it's happening in Portland, Maine, in their June election. So I'm definitely paying attention to that and seeing how that plays out, because that's going to be very important for our party. I think really, instead of, people are afraid to join a new party because they don't see high success rates, right? Like you pointed out. And I think that a lot of people who are more moderate leaning or independent Pew Research has done a lot of, obviously, polling on this, and they do tend to lean Democrat when they vote. And so I think you have to take the language a lot of times and say, listen, what we need right now is just to blur lines of ideology. We need to say, we're not in any ideology except we have really good ideas on both sides. We really do. I mean, take poverty, for example. I'm from Kentucky, and Eastern Kentucky is one of the most impoverished places in the United States, and I used to teach in Eastern Kentucky. If you took Republicans who are obsessed with capitalism, and if you took liberals who are obsessed with helping the poor, and you put those two ideas together for 24 hours, I believe we could solve problems of poverty, because we blurred lines of ideology and we just said, you guys have really good ideas, you guys have really good ideas, here's your platform, let's put it together, let's see what we can do along with innovation in the world of technology and the private sector. And it's very important. We all have one heartbeat, and if we stop in any of those veins, I mean, it's not as efficient.
Thank you so much to our panelists. We really appreciate you being here. If we get a round of applause for